At exactly 3:42 a.m., President Ibrahim Traoré stormed into a hidden gold mine in the darkness of the Burkinabe forest. There he found 21 to 17 terrified children, some just 5 years old, covered in dust, beaten, starving, and forced to dig for gold with bleeding hands. He risked his own life to free them that night. But just days later, a shocking video exploded online accusing him of exploiting those same children for illegal mining. Suddenly, the hero was branded a monster, and his country was torn apart by rage and doubt. Can the truth survive in a world where lies spread faster than justice? And how far will evil go to silence a man who dares to protect the innocent? And it all began that evening while the rest of Ouagadougou lay wrapped in silence. The clock above the presidential office glowed a faint green. 23:43 as President Ibrahim Traoré sat hunched over a cluttered desk, squinting at documents scattered like fallen leaves. Outside the warm African night pressed gently against tall windows. But inside the palace, the only sounds were the scratch of a fountain pen and the faint hum of the ceiling fan spinning in lazy circles. Traoré, with sleeves rolled up and shadows beneath his eyes, frowned over a budget proposal for building schools in the northern provinces, pausing now and then to sip from a battered porcelain mug. The coffee inside was so strong it could strip paint. Yet he grimaced after each swallow, as if daring it to keep him awake. A lanky young aide wearing thick glasses in an expression of perpetual worry tiptoed into the office and cleared his throat as though approaching a lion. "Mr. President, perhaps you could rest for an hour, even just a half hour." Traoré looked up, eyes blazing with wry humor and replied, "I'll sleep when the children of Burkina Faso sleep safe in their beds and when someone finally invents a coffee that doesn't taste like motor oil." The aide blinked, half amused, half horrified, and mumbled, "Yes, sir, but your doctor says if you keep drinking that stuff, your heart might jump out of your chest and start its own revolution." Traoré let out a low chuckle and waved a dismissive hand. "If my heart wants a revolution, tell it to wait until after we fix the education budget." The aide hovered uncertainly, juggling a folder in a steaming cup labeled decaf, trying to slip it onto the president's desk. Traoré spotted the label, recoiled as if from a snake, and muttered, "Decaf is for traitors." The aide backed away, defeated, while Traoré returned to his papers, the faintest of smiles lingering on his face. But the quiet didn't last. It never did in a place where power and danger sleep under the same roof. A sharp insistent beep sliced through the silence as the red light on Traoré's secure telephone began blinking like a warning flare. His hand froze above his pen, pulse suddenly pounding in his ears. For a call on that line after midnight meant only one thing: crisis. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted the receiver. His voice, usually smooth and warm, came out low and cautious. "This is the president." For a moment, there was only static and shallow breathing, so fragile it seemed the caller might vanish into the darkness entirely. Then a voice cracked into existence, trembling, but urgent, as if each word was dragged out of a pit of terror. "Please, Mr. President, I know I shouldn't be using this line. They'll kill me if they find out, but I had no choice." Traoré leaned forward, his chair creaking, eyes narrowing like a hawking on to prey. "Who are you? What's happened?" The voice came faster now, desperation spilling over. "It's the children, more than 200 of them, little ones, 5 years old, some of them. They're trapped in an illegal gold mine near Campena. They're starving, working until their hands bleed. They're treated like animals." The words hit Traoré like hammer blows. In that instant, the ruler of a nation disappeared, leaving behind only a father, a soldier, and a man who had sworn an oath to protect his people. His jaw clenched so tightly that muscle flickered along his cheekbone, and the lights of the city outside seemed to blur. "Where exactly?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut steel. The caller swallowed hard, voice shaking. "Take the old forest road past the abandoned lumber mill. There's a hidden path. Nobody goes there anymore. Please, Mr. President, you're the only one who can stop this." Then abruptly, the line went dead. Static swallowed the final syllables, leaving only silence and the faint buzzing of fluorescent lights overhead. For the briefest second, Traoré stared at the receiver as if willing the voice to come back. Then he slammed the handset down and shot to his feet. Some children were knee-deep in pits of wet clay, hacking at the walls with rusted chisels, while others staggered under the weight of sacks slung across their backs, their thin legs trembling with every step. The air was thick with dust that glittered gold where the light struck it, as if mocking them with the promise of wealth for which these children paid in blood and bone. Traoré's breath caught in his chest. A heavy stone lodged beneath his ribs as he took in the scene. A sharp cry rang out, slicing the hush. A young boy, no older than 7, collapsed face first into the sludge, his small hands scrabbling weakly at the mud. One of the guards, an enormous man with a club slung over his shoulder, stormed over and kicked the boy hard in the ribs. The child gave a thin, breathless wheeze, but did not get up. The guard shouted something guttural and raised his boot as if to stomp the boy into the dirt. Traoré felt his own pulse roar like thunder in his ears, rage boiling up so fast that for a moment he couldn't see anything but red. He clenched his fists until his knuckles cracked, his voice a low, lethal growl as he whispered to Commander Sorrow. He was too small to carry a bucket of sand, but they kicked him anyway. Around them, the soldiers' faces turned grim, eyes glinting with murderous fury. The laughter from moments ago was gone, replaced by a silence so dense it seemed to press down on their shoulders like a physical weight. For in that pit of golden tears, President Traoré and his men were staring into the eyes of pure evil, and they knew that tonight there would be no mercy for the monsters who had stolen these children's lives. The pit lay before them, pulsing with harsh yellow light and echoing with the metallic clang of tools, the soft cries of children, in the occasional bark of an order from one of the guards. President Traoré crouched behind a tangled wall of vines, eyes glinting coldly as he studied the layout below, his mind already mapping out how to strike. Beside him, Commander Sorrow whispered coordinates into a radio, his voice tight and controlled while soldiers slid silencers onto their rifles and checked their gear with clinical precision. Even in the thick tension, sweat trickled down foreheads and over tense jaws. The forest's humid breath clinging to every patch of skin. But despite the weight of what they were about to do, there was one thing nobody could account for. Human clumsiness. Private Soba, who had only minutes earlier been lamenting his missing boot, was now crouched low and trembling, his eyes huge as dinner plates. He fumbled with a smoke grenade clipped to his belt, trying to unnap it as quietly as possible. His finger slipped once, then twice, then the third time. He yanked so hard that the small metal pin flew out of his hand and hit a rock with a tiny ping. The sound seemed to echo like a gunshot in the still night. Every head snapped toward him. Even the cricket seemed to stop chirping. Tapsoba froze, still gripping the grenade as if praying it would somehow become invisible. A fellow soldier hissed, "SH." So forcefully it was nearly a scream, while Commander Sorrow's eyes bulged as though they might pop out of his skull. Traoré slowly turned his head toward the hapless soldier face somewhere between murderous fury and stunned disbelief and whispered with acid calm, "Tapsoba, would you like to announce our arrival by loudspeaker as well?" For a few seconds, the entire team held its collective breath. Then Tapsoba, sweating buckets, stammered, "Sorry, our sir. I'm new at this." Another soldier muttered, "Well, congratulations. You've just invented the noisiest silent operation in history." Despite himself, Traoré let out a short, strangled laugh that slipped between clenched teeth. Even in moments of mortal danger, absurdity had a way of creeping in like an unwanted guest, and for a single heartbeat, the grim reality of the mission seemed to lift off their shoulders. But the laughter died as quickly as it had flared. Traoré signaled with a sharp flick of his hand. "Positions. We go in 3. The soldiers melted back into the foliage. Eyes narrow, breath shallow, every muscle coiled like a spring. As the final seconds ticked away, Traoré stared down into the mine, memorizing every guard's position, every possible path of escape. His jaw tightened as he imagined those children screaming under fists and boots. No more. Then all hell broke loose. On Traoré's whispered command, a cascade of smoke bombs sailed through the air, landing with dull thuds into the open pit. Thick clouds billowed up, swallowing the flickering lights in a rolling tide of gray. Guards began shouting in confusion. Weapons raised as visibility dropped to near nothing. Gunshots cracked in sharp bursts, quick and surgical as Traoré's men stormed down the rocky slope like ghosts, their figures flickering in and out of the swirling haze. Some guards tried to flee but stumbled into waiting soldiers who tackled them to the ground and snapped on plastic cuffs. Through the chaos came the shrill wails of terrified children, echoing off the pit walls as little hands flailed in the smoke. Traoré pushed forward, his boots slamming into the muddy earth, eyes locked on a group of tiny figures huddled behind a pile of rubble. He raised both arms high and called out, voice steady, powerful enough to cut through the beatum. "I am your president, and I've come to take you home." The words rolled across the pit like a wave, and for a moment, all motion seemed to stop. Little faces turned toward him, eyes wide and shining with fear and disbelief. One child dropped his pickaxe. Another gasped and let out a tiny sob. And then the dam broke. A dozen children rushed toward him, mud splattering as they ran, crying and grabbing his uniform as though clinging to a lifeline in a raging sea. Behind him, soldiers spread out, securing the perimeter while the last few guards were dragged away in zip ties, struggling and cursing into the smoke. Trey bent down, scooping up a trembling girl who weighed almost nothing in his arms. He whispered into her hair, "You're safe now. You're going home." In the swirling smoke and harsh glow of floodlights, it looked for a heartbeat as though a man had pulled light itself out of darkness, standing alone in the mine, surrounded by children who no longer had to dig for gold at the cost of their souls. The sun rose pale and tender over Ouagadougou, spilling soft gold through high windows as the convoy rolled into the secure shelter compound. The children, filthy and trembling hours earlier, now peered out wide-eyed from the back of jeeps, squinting into daylight as though they'd emerged from some underworld. Inside the shelter's courtyard, doctors and volunteers bustled about, carrying blankets, bottled water, and clean clothes. His chair toppled behind him as he stabbed a finger at the intercom. "Get General Matty. Get Commander Sorrow. We leave tonight." His voice thundered through the office, each word drenched in fury and purpose. No one argued. No one dared. In those moments, the weariness melted off his shoulders like mist under a rising sun. He was no longer the night owl president who joked about coffee. He was the man who would drive through the shadows of the forest to save children he had never met. For Ibrahim Traoré, the night had turned into a battlefield, and he was ready to march into its heart. Outside the presidential palace gates, black jeeps idled under a silver slice of moon, engines rumbling like beasts eager to be unleashed. Soldiers scrambled across the courtyard in a flurry of gear, slamming rifles into holsters, adjusting bulletproof vests, and shouting over each other in a swirl of chaos that somehow smelled like sweat and gun oil. The urgency was so electric that nobody noticed Private Tapsoba sprinting back and forth, wildeed and still barefoot. He dove into a pile of crates, tossing helmets and ration packs aside until he emerged holding only one rubber flip-flop. "I can't find my other boot," he wailed, waving the single flip-flop above his head as if brandishing a trophy. Commander Sorrow, already in full combat gear, planted both hands on his hips and barked, "Tapsa, we are not invading Paris Fashion Week." But before he could finish, President Traoré stalked past, pausing just long enough to raise an eyebrow and mutter, "We're saving children tonight, not going to a fashion show." Laughter rippled through the men, sharp and sudden, like a crack of thunder, easing the tension before a storm. Even Tapsoba managed a sheepish grin, clutching his lone flip-flop to his chest like a newborn. Moments later, Traoré climbed into the lead jeep, slamming the door with a finality that seemed to echo through the courtyard. The humor drained away as quickly as it had come. Engines roared in synchronized fury, and one by one, the convoy rolled out. Headlights extinguished to merge with the dark. The city streets, usually choked with vendors and exhaust fumes, were silent as tombs at this hour, every shadow stretching long and deep as the vehicles sped past concrete buildings and low brick walls. Traoré sat rigid in his seat, eyes scanning the road ahead, mind burning with the words of that trembling caller. He glanced back once at the long black snake of vehicles behind him, and for a heartbeat, his chest tightened with the knowledge that each man had trusted him enough to follow him into a night that might swallow them whole. Soon the city fell away, giving way to a landscape of endless scrub and dry earth. Moonlight spilled like liquid silver over the roofs of sleeping villages, where corrugated metal shimmered faintly, and the rustle of palm fronds whispered secrets into the wind. The convoy tore along dusty roads, raising plumes of reddish dust that sparkled in the beams of occasional high beams flicked on and off like Morse code. Along the roadside, the shapes of huts drifted in and out of sight. Ghostly silhouettes framed by the soft glow of dying fires. People slept in mud huts, the narrator intoned, voice low and edged with sorrow, while monsters plotted in gold. It was a cruel paradox, Traoré thought, how peace could lay its blanket over one side of the forest, while just beyond the trees, horror sharpened its claws in secret. The further they drove, the thicker the forest grew. Acacia trees leaned across the road, branches clawing at the jeeps as if trying to drag them back. The air smelled of dust and damp earth, mingling with the gasoline fumes of the convoy. Inside the vehicles, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional burst of static from radios and the distant yelp of nocturnal animals in the bush. Traoré's mind raced with images he wished he could banish, tiny hands clawing at rock, hollow eyes shining in the glow of work lamps, children's bones bending under the weight of a gold-fledged burden. With each mile, the darkness thickened until it seemed less like night and more like the maw of some great beast preparing to swallow them all. But even his fear nipped at the edges of his resolve. Traoré set his jaw, gripping the dashboard, and whispered to himself, "No child will be left in that hell. Not on my watch." Branches clawed at the convoy as the jeeps edged deeper into the forest, creeping forward inch by inch. Lights off, engines reduced to trembling whispers. The soldiers moved like shadows, weapons ready, eyes darting through the gloom as the forest seemed to breathe around them. Somewhere unseen, an owl hooted, its cry eerie in the hush. But it wasn't the owl that stole everyone's focus. It was the crickets. They were so loud, so insistent, chirping in frantic waves, as though the entire insect kingdom were holding a heated debate. One particularly shrill burst made President Traoré freeze in his tracks. He tilted his head toward the darkness and muttered under his breath. "Even the insects are gossiping tonight." His dry remark cut through the tension like a blade, and several soldiers struggled not to laugh aloud, pressing hands over their mouths to stifle nervous giggles. Commander Sorrow, who seconds before had been scanning the trees with deadly focus, let out a wheezing chuckle and whispered, "If they start singing national anthems, I'm out." Even in the shadows of a mission soaked in danger, humor flickered among them like fireflies, reminding everyone that they were still human, still alive. But the laughter vanished as quickly as it came, sucked into the dark silence like breath into a vacuum. Traoré raised his hand, palm open, signaling everyone to stop. The men dropped into crouches, weapons at the ready. Every face turned toward a low metallic clinking coming from deeper in the brush. At first, it was barely audible, like spoons rattling in a distant kitchen. But as they inched forward, crouching beneath hanging vines and stepping over twisted roots, the sound grew sharper. Pickaxes striking stone, shovels scraping earth, and the occasional soft moan that made the hair rise on the back of Traoré's neck. Pushing through a final curtain of foliage, they emerged at the rim of a natural depression. A vast crater dug into the earth like a wound. And there it was, the illegal mine lit by flickering yellow floodlights perched at top wooden poles, their glow sputtering as though ashamed to reveal what lay below. In the shallow pit, dozens upon dozens of small figures moved like ghosts. Their skinny bodies caked in mud and dust that turned them into colorless shapes against the churned earth. Soldiers stood in neat rows, weapons slung over shoulders, eyes scanning for threats, but softening as they watched little faces pressed against windows. President Traoré stepped out of his jeep first, still wearing the grime of the mine on his uniform, and the moment his boots hit the courtyard tiles, a cheer rose up from the assembled staff, a sound equal parts relief, admiration, and gratitude. Within the shelter, children sat on plastic chairs, shivering beneath blankets as nurses dabbed antiseptic onto bruised skin and checked temperatures with gentle fingers. And yet, even here, in a place meant to be safe, a spark of laughter somehow found its way through the lingering fear. It happened when a little girl, no more than 6 years old, watched Traoré stride past with his commanding presence. Her eyes grew huge, round as saucers, and with sudden, startling precision, she leapt off her chair, planted her feet wide, and bellowed in a surprisingly firm voice, "You stand straight. Hands up." She pointed a tiny finger at one of the towering soldiers nearby, who blinked in shock before snapping to attention like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. The room burst into peals of laughter, nurses clutching their stomachs, soldiers grinning ear to ear. Even Traoré, who for days had carried the weight of unspeakable horrors, threw back his head and laughed. The deep rolling kind of laugh that shakes the shadows off a man's shoulders for a moment. The little girl, emboldened by the attention, began marching back and forth in perfect mimicry, her brows furrowed in a perfect imitation of presidential authority, barking out orders. "You there? Yes, you smile when I say so." She spun toward Traoré, planting tiny fists on her hips. "And you, Mr. President, drink less coffee." The entire room roared so loud that for a few seconds, the world felt normal again, as though monsters with guns and hidden mines were nothing but bad dreams. Yet, beneath the laughter, shadows still gathered. As the sun climbed higher, long conversations hummed in corners where guards whispered urgently to each other, their eyes darting toward the doors as though expecting enemies to burst in at any second. Traoré noticed a pair of soldiers, heads bent close, voices too low for others to hear. One of them, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool tiles, muttered, "Some rich men are furious. They're saying Traoré humiliated them, cost them millions. They won't let this go." His companion shot a nervous look toward the children gathered on plastic chairs. "They'll fight back? Maybe not tonight. Maybe not next week, but they'll come." A chill passed between them despite the warm glow of the morning sun spilling across the floor. The words hung heavy in the air as oppressive as iron chains. Traoré, catching fragments of these conversations as he moved through the shelter, felt a cold tightness wrap around his heart. His gaze swept over the children. Children who now sat eating bowls of hot rice, giggling over new toys or drifting into exhausted sleep under clean blankets. He clenched his jaw and thought saving them was the easy part, because lurking behind every bright curtain and clean bed was a truth he knew too well. Evil never forgets, and the men who had profited from the children's suffering were already plotting how to claw back what they'd lost. By the third day, the shelter had become a hive of activity. Doctors hurried between cots carrying charts and syringes. Volunteers handed out bowls of steaming porridge, and the children, still adjusting to sunlight and safety, were beginning to discover toys and crayons as if they were artifacts from a forgotten world. Outside the gates, armed guards maintained a strict perimeter, letting no one through without multiple layers of checks. But in a country bruised by secrets and power games, even walls and soldiers were sometimes no match for a well-placed bribe and a wolf in sheep's clothing. It started with the arrival of 2 white vans parked neatly outside the shelter gates, each plastered in bold, colorful logos of an international humanitarian group that no one seemed to have heard of before. Out stepped a group of men and women in crisp shirts and plastic ID badges. Their smiles so wide they seemed almost painted on. They carried stuffed animals, boxes of sweets, and expensive-looking camera equipment. And one of them, a lanky man with gleaming teeth and sunglasses perched atop his head, waved grandly at the guards. "We're from Global Children's Relief," he boomed, voice dripping with practiced warmth. "We're here to show the world the good work being done for these beautiful children." The guards, initially suspicious, exchanged glances. But as the fake journalists began passing out little sachets of candy to nearby soldiers, a few of the men began to soften, laughter flickering around the edges of their disciplined scowls. One guard, obviously torn between duty and the offer of sweet chocolate, finally stepped aside with a muttered warning. 30 minutes, no more. Inside the shelter, the so-called journalists breezed through the halls with exaggerated cheer, cooping over the children in sing-song voices. "Oh, look at you. So cute." One woman leaned close to a little boy scribbling with a crayon and whispered, "Conspirator ally, hey kid, want to be famous?" The boy blinked up at her, his eyes still rimmed in red from days of dust and tears. Another man crouched beside a girl clutching a battered stuffed bear, holding out a handful of brightly colored lollipops. "Here you go, sweetheart," he murmured, flashing a grin so oily it might have powered a generator. "All you have to do is tell us a little story. That nice man in the green suit, he made you dig for gold, right?" For a moment, the girl stared at the candy as if it might bite her, then turned her eyes to the floor. It was a performance so overdone it bordered on the absurd, like a troupe of clowns who had wandered into a hospital ward by mistake. One volunteer nearby, watching the spectacle unfold, muttered under his breath, "Reporters or circus clowns? Hard to tell the difference." Another whispered, "They're laying it on thicker than peanut butter." Yet beneath the comedic excess, something darker simmered. A sense of poison hidden under all the forced smiles and sugary bribes. That poison spilled into the open when hours later the first grainy video appeared online. Filmed on hidden cameras and cut together with jarring, sensational music. It showed trembling children speaking into the lens in halting, frightened voices. "The president made us work in the gold mine," one child whispered. Another stammered. They said we had to dig or we'd be hurt." The video, expertly edited with shots of crying faces in the pit itself, twisted the truth into something monstrous. Within hours, the footage had ignited social media like dry tinder catching fire. Furious posts exploded across Facebook and Twitter. News tickers on international channels screamed headlines and block letters. President Traoré accused of child exploitation. In city streets, groups began gathering. Some waving hand-painted signs demanding answers, others hurling accusations into the humid air. Inside the shelter, staff huddled around phones and televisions, faces pale and stunned. Volunteers wept openly as they watched children they just bathed and fed now appear on screen as supposed victims of the very man who'd saved them. One nurse dropped her clipboard, her voice shaking. "This will destroy him. It'll destroy everything." Somewhere in the back corridors, guards argued in low voices about orders, bribes, and loyalty. The walls of the shelter, only days earlier, echoing with cautious laughter, now seemed to close in, thick with a creeping sense of betrayal. And in the center of it all, stood President Ibrahim Traoré, silent, watching the flickering images on a small television set as his name was dragged through the mud. His jaw was clenched so tight a vein pulsed in his temple. But his eyes burned with something fiercer than anger because he knew the truth. And he knew that the men who had built their fortune on children's backs were now trying to kill him with lies instead of bullets. And though the video had gone viral, one thought slammed through his mind like a hammer blow. This war isn't over. It's just begun. It was past midnight when President Ibrahim Traoré returned to the shelter, slipping through the side gates like a thief instead of a head of state. The guard stiffened as he passed, but he lifted one finger to his lips and murmured, "Shoo. No one needs to know I'm here tonight." His face was lined and shadowed, exhaustion written in every crease. Yet his eyes still burned with purpose. He moved quietly through darkened corridors, boots whispering across the cool tile floors until he reached the children's sleeping area. A large hall filled with rows of cots where soft snoring rose and fell like waves on the sea. Overhead, faint moonlight spilled in through narrow windows, silvering the edges of blankets and casting long, gentle shadows on the walls. Traoré paused at the door, then crept inside, scanning the rows until he spotted a cluster of children still awake, huddled together, whispering as if secrets might keep the nightmares away. With mischief twinkling behind his fatigue, he crouched low and tiptoed along the edge of the room, slipping behind a long curtain that divided one section of CS from the next. He cleared his throat in an exaggerated stage whisper and called out, "Where's my brave soldiers? I'm looking for my heroes." For a moment, the children froze, eyes wide, glancing at one another as if debating whether ghosts might talk in familiar voices. Then, from behind a stack of blankets, a boy's voice piped up, half laughing, half scolding, "Mr. President, you're bad at hiding." The words echoed off the quiet walls, and the children erupted into giggles so loud that a nurse down the hall stuck her head in, frowning and whispering, "SH. People are trying to sleep." Traoré pushed aside the curtain, feigning shock. "What? You found me so quickly? I must be losing my touch." He threw his hands up dramatically, pretending to surrender as several small children leapt forward, wrapping arms around his waist. One tiny girl tried to imitate his stern expression, planting her fists on her hips and declaring, "Mr. President, you're under arrest for bad hiding." Even in the chaos of a country teetering on lies and conspiracies, laughter bloomed like a stubborn flower in a barren desert. For a few brief moments, everything ugly in the world seemed impossibly far away, and the man who carried the weight of an entire nation found himself chuckling until his sides ached. But as the laughter faded, so did the sense of safety. Traoré knelt on the floor among the children, his knees popping softly, and lowered his voice until it was barely a breath. "My children, I need to ask you something important." The children exchanged nervous glances, fidgeting with blanket edges, stuffing small fists into their mouths. Traoré looked from face to face, eyes shining with gentle sorrow. "You remember the people who came here with cameras, the ones who gave you candy?" A hush fell like a stone. One boy, cheeks strewn with silent tears, nodded slowly. His voice was little more than a whisper. They told us to say things, bad things about you. They said if we did, people would come get us and take us away somewhere nice." His chin quivered and his eyes dropped to the floor. Another girl wiped her nose on the sleeve of her new pink sweater. "They said you made us dig for gold, but you didn't. You saved us. They gave us sweets and said we'd be free forever if we lied." Her voice cracked as though it might shatter entirely, and she covered her face with both hands. Traoré reached out gently, pulling her hands away and holding them between his own. His fingers, usually firm and commanding, trembled as he spoke. "My children," he began, but had to pause, throat tightening, until the next words broke loose like splinters. "They used you like weapons." His voice cracked on the last word, and he shut his eyes, pressing his forehead to the girl's small, shaking hands. Around them, the other children began to cry. Soft, hiccuping sobs that filled the dim room with the sound of heartbreak. The boy who scolded Traoré moments earlier curled into his side, bearing his face in the president's uniform. Traoré wrapped one arm around the boy, his eyes glistening, fury and grief warring in his chest. "I will make this right," he whispered. "I swear it. No one will use you again." And in the shadows of the shelter, among trembling voices and quiet tears, the battle lines were drawn not just for the children's freedom, but for the soul of an entire nation. The sun glared bright and sharp over Ouagadougou, bouncing off the white paint of the rescue shelter like a spotlight demanding answers. Inside, tension buzzed like electricity as rows of chairs were dragged into neat lines. Microphones tested with harsh bursts of static and video cameras hummed as their red lights flickered on and off. The place smelled of disinfectant and hot cables. A strange blend of hospital and new studio. Journalists from all corners of the globe shuffled in, clutching notepads, cameras, and steaming cups of coffee as if the caffeine alone could steady their frayed nerves. In one corner, a wiry man with a huge lens slung around his neck argued furiously with a woman in a crisp blazer over where to place the main camera. "If I'm here, the lights hit my shot perfectly," he snapped, gesturing like a traffic cop. The woman shot back, "Your lens is blocking half the background. Nobody wants your giant head in the frame." Across the room, another man with dark circles under his eyes slumped into a plastic chair and grumbled, "I'm missing my wife's birthday for this. If this press conference doesn't blow up the internet, I'm getting divorced for nothing." Nearby, a local Birkin Bay reporter whispered into his mic for a live feed. "This is either going to be the day Trey saves his legacy or loses everything." Laughter and exasperated sighs mingled in the air. A strange soundtrack to a room bracing for revelations that could shake a nation. Despite the comedic chaos, a tremor of anticipation underpinned every movement as though everyone present knew they were perched on the edge of history. Technicians adjusted lights so bright they bleached the walls pale, and translators hovered nervously, waiting to relay whatever bombshells might drop into French, English, and half a dozen other tongues. President Traoré stood just beyond the doorway, watching the crowd through a slim gap in the door, jaw set, fists opening and closing at his sides. His uniform was clean now, but shadows lingered beneath his eyes like bruises. Around him stood trusted advisors and Commander Sorrow, all stiff with anxiety, as if the room beyond might swallow them whole. Then the door swung open, and the reporters fell instantly silent, as if someone had thrown a switch. Cameras pivoted toward the entrance. Flash bulbs popped like fireworks. President Traoré stepped forward, his face grave, but his spine straight as a spear. Behind him filed in the children, freshly bathed, dressed in crisp, colorful clothes and blinking under the harsh studio lights. The children clustered close together, clutching hands, eyes darting nervously around the room, whispers rising and falling like a fragile breeze. For a moment, no one moved. The hush was so deep it felt like the air itself held its breath. Then Tro cleared his throat and said, voice low and steady, "I have not come here today to defend myself. I have come to defend the truth." A ripple of murmurs swept through the reporters. Microphones edged closer. Cameras zoomed in until Trey's every blink filled the screens. He gestured gently to the children beside him. "These are my children, the children of Burkina Faso, and they have something to tell you." He stepped aside, allowing a young boy of about 8 to move forward. The boy swallowed hard, staring into the glaring lights, his small fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. He saved us," the boy said, voice trembling, but growing steadier. "He's not a monster. He's the one who took us out of that place. He gave us food. He said we were free." Another girl stepped forward, her hair pulled back in tidy braids, her eyes shining under the lights. "Those people with the cameras, they told us to say bad things. They promised to take us somewhere safe if we lied. But it wasn't true. He saved us." As the words spilled from their lips, reporters gasped softly. Camera crews edged closer, lenses trained on tiny faces glistening with tears. One veteran journalist, his face usually a mask of cynicism, lowered his camera and scrubbed a hand over his eyes, blinking back moisture. President Traoré stood motionless, his chest rising and falling as though every breath was a battle, his eyes glistened in the harsh glare of the lights, and when he finally spoke again, his voice cracked under the weight of all he'd carried. "My children, my beautiful children, the truth will not die in darkness. It will shine." A hush fell across the room deeper than before. Even the ever-arguing journalists were struck silent as though realizing they were witnessing something far bigger than a political scandal. And in that moment, aware and cameras rolling, lights blazing, and the eyes of the world watching, the tide began to turn. A spark of belief ignited among those who doubted and whispers of hope rippled outward like rings in water. But though the truth was beginning to break through the lies, Traoré knew deep in his bones that the battle was far from over. Because men who could chain children in darkness would not surrender their secrets without one final fight. Deep inside the presidential compound, under flickering fluorescent lights and the hum of an ancient ceiling fan, Pascal Nikma sat slumped in a plastic chair, sweat pouring off his brow as though someone had poured a bucket over his head. His shirt clung to his back, darkened in patches, and he kept glancing around the interrogation room as if expecting the walls themselves to start accusing him. Commander Sorrow leaned over the table, voice low and dangerous. "Pascal, tell us who gave the order for the video. Tell us who's behind all of this." Pascal licked his dry lips, eyes darting toward the soldiers flanking the door. Am I getting witness protection and lunch?" He blurted out, voice cracking high enough to make one of the soldiers snort despite himself. Sorrow rolled his eyes so hard it seemed they might disappear into his skull. "Lunch? You sold out the president and endangered children's lives. And you're worried about lunch? Pascal held up trembling hands. I'm hypoglycemic. Okay. The room fell silent. Then another soldier choked out a surprised laugh. Even Sorrow cracked a reluctant grin. God help us. What? Fine. Somebody get the man a sandwich. For one brief bizarre moment, laughter rippled through the tension. As if even in the darkest places, absurdity insisted on showing up uninvited. But the humor dissolved the instant Pascal leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It's Vincent Cabaret. He's the one who paid the fake journalists. He's the one who runs the mines. He has documents, names, bribes, everything. He's hiding in his estate near the border with armed guards. Traoré, who had been standing silent in the shadows, stepped forward, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm, his voice cut the air. Then we go tonight, Pascal swallowed audibly. Can I still get that sandwich? Soar threw his hand skyward in exasperation. Hours later, under a pitch-black sky, the convoy rolled fast and silent through twisting back roads, headlights off, engines humming like low thunder. They arrived at Vincent Cabaret's estate, a sprawling compound ringed with high walls and towering floodlights, guarded by men armed to the teeth. President Traoré himself rode in the lead jeep, eyes narrowed, heart hammering with a mix of fury and grim purpose. The soldiers burst through the gates in a coordinated wave, shouting orders, smoke grenades billowing into the night air. Guards scrambled in panic, some firing wildly, others dropping their weapons as Traoré's men surged forward, moving room to room. Inside the mansion, flames leapt skyward as stacks of papers went up in smoke, embers swirling like angry fireflies. At the heart of it all, they found Vincent Cabaret standing beside a fireplace where burning documents hissed and crackled. His crisp white shirt was stained with sweat and soot, but his face wore a twisted grin. As soldiers rushed him, he held up his wrist with almost theatrical flourish. Power can't be jailed, or can it? He taunted, his voice echoing off marble walls. Sorrow grabbed him roughly. Guess we're about to find out. Vincent laughed as they dragged him away, a sound that somehow chilled the room more than the burning heat. Traoré watched him go, jaw tight, eyes burning with the knowledge that this was only one victory in a far longer war. 2 days later, sunshine spilled through open windows at the rescue shelter, pouring over rows of new desks and the bright colors of neatly folded school uniforms stacked on tables. Children bustled about in high spirits, some clutching pencils like magic wands, others peeking shyly into mirrors to admire the crisp collars and shiny buttons of their brand new clothes. President Traoré stood near the entrance, arms folded, watching the laughter with an expression that blended quiet pride and lingering sorrow. In the far corner, a volunteer knelt beside a group of girls trying on skirts and blouses. One little girl, no taller than Traoré's hip, yanked at the waistband of her uniform skirt, frowning ferociously. "Why is my skirt so long?" she demanded, voice shrill with frustration. Another girl piped up, giggling. "Because you're short." The first girl planted her fists on her hips, glaring at Traoré as if he personally tailored the offending garment. "Mr. President, this skirt is trying to eat my knees." Traoré burst into laughter so genuine that everyone nearby turned to stare. "I'll talk to the Tor," he promised, wiping tears from the corners of his eyes. Soldiers and nurses chuckled, shaking their heads as children twirled and tugged at sleeves, delighted to be fussing over something as normal as school clothes. Yet beneath the laughter, the threat still coiled like a hidden snake. That afternoon, as the children napped or played quietly, Traoré retreated to his office, seeking a moment's peace. But a folded piece of paper waited on his desk, placed there by unknown hands. His breath hitched as he read the single line scrolled in block letters. "Stay silent or another child will disappear." A tremor of rage flickered through him, setting his jaw hard as granite. He crushed the paper in his fist until it was nothing but a tight, trembling ball. His voice emerged low and fierce. Numbry refused to be silent while evil hides in shadows. Late that evening, as orange sunset bled across the sky, Traoré returned to the shelter. The children flocked around him, clutching the edges of his uniform, laughing, chattering about their new books and classrooms. He looked over the small crowd, his expression softening despite the storm that still raged in his chest. Then he raised his voice, letting it carry over the courtyard. "These children are the soul of our nation, and as long as I breathe, I will protect them." The staff fell quiet, some wiping away tears. In the silence, one little girl took his hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. Traoré knelt to meet her eyes. She whispered, "Are the bad men gone forever?" He drew in a long, steady breath, then spoke with a quiet conviction that cut deeper than any shout. "Not yet, my child, but I promise you they will be." And with the sky fading into stars, President Ibrahim Traoré stood in the glow of the shelter lights, surrounded by children who had once been prisoners in darkness. Now safe, now free, and finally beginning to believe that monsters could be defeated. The character of Ibrahim Traoré and all other characters, events, and organizations depicted in this story are entirely fictional and created for storytelling purposes. They do not represent any real individuals, living or dead, nor do they reflect real events. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more dramatic, powerful tales that shine a light on justice and humanity, please subscribe to my channel. Hit the like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss our next story. Thank you for watching.